All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Lost Dogs and Mixed Blessings podcast. Today, we are actually going to talk about Earl's first book that he ever wrote. So it's Rewilding the Heart of Ministry. So that's what we're talking about today. So, Earl, could you just walk us through what was your process and your inspiration? What led you to writing this book?
So you're asking me the same question I asked you about your book, which was a complicated question.
Yes.
um,
I'm dishing
you
it
know,
back.
yeah, fair enough. Um, it actually started from being on a pastoral prayer meeting over Zoom, and it was early COVID days, right? So Zoom was the way that we connected, right? And hopped on there, and like I knew all these guys, I knew them well enough to know that they're good men. They were good pastors. We're all part of the same network, so we spoke a lot of the same language, so to speak. But there was something that was just in my head that was kind of annoying me, and it was like round the screen as we went on. Everybody was just like, "Oh, we were so blessed yesterday. The so and so showed up, and it was like we were so blessed, and this and all was so blessed. Everyone was blessed." Now it got to me, and I just like, guys, I'm so sick of hearing the word blessed. And then they were like, like this, and I said, like, I mean, let me explain. It's just like, I want to know how to pray for you guys. I want to know how to pray for your marriages, for your children. I want to know how to pray for your churches. If you have a problem, in right now that you need to solve, is there something that we can, as a group, rally behind you and support? Like, that's what I want to hear. It's not that I don't want to hear about the blessing and the goodness and the graciousness and the wonderful worship services that they had in the new buildings. It's not like I want to hear about all of it, but I also want to hear the nitty gritty of what's causing you trouble, and for you to like wake up early in the morning or not sleep at night. That's what I want to be able to pray for, and I wanted that kind of authenticity. And it was funny because like there was like no response whatsoever to what I said, but I got an email afterwards from the group organizer, and he was just like, "Dude," he says, "thank you." He says, "like that was great." I did not get invited back the next time.
Oh no.
So the group took a bit of a break. It wasn't just me, but and I did end up coming back to the group and stuff. But it was that is what started the idea. Is just that I had read so many books about the can do's, should do's, would do's, um, but I wanted so desperately for someone to share the nitty gritty and the underbelly, because the first couple of years of ministry are brutally difficult, especially if you're pastoring a church, and no one prepared me for that. And I had to kind of figure things out on my own. Now, having said that, I had a good mentor. I did have financial support from the church to pay the rent in my facility for about 6 months. I wasn't stranded. I don't want to leave that off. But when it came down to this is how you deal with the troubled child that's coming in your doors, I didn't know what to do, and I
Hmm.
ended up leaning on other pastors. So, anyways, a long story to that short question. That's how I started writing this book. It was just a brutally honest approach um, to what ministry requires of someone, and how you get through the hard days. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
One
It's cool.
one thing I noticed through reading this book, and as you just mentioned, it is geared towards and focused towards a rethinking, or as you used it, rewilding of ministry. And this book was written out of as a result of a pastoral conference you're at. But as I read it, I could get this sense of it doesn't just apply to ministers. So many of the ideas that you bring up in this book, I think, are applicable to all of us, and not just those within the church, just even as just somebody who goes to church or is somewhat involved in church, but even outside the church in business and organizations, and a lot of that. Now, from your point of view, was that intentional, or is that just sort of a fun byproduct of how you wrote that, of how all these things can kind of be applied? So this really isn't just for ministers. Anybody could really grab hold of this book, I think, and learn from it the lessons that you talk about in this.
Yeah, that's cool. No, it wasn't an intentional thing at first. I did have commentary when I first published it, that, oh, this is for pastors, not, they're like, somebody who isn't a pastor won't relate to it. And I thought, well, no, that's not true. Like, it's really anybody who's got their hand to the plow or doing something, where they're in leadership or even, surrounded by leadership. I think actually it can make a lot of sense, because there's times where, what do you do when things get so mundane and habitual that you start to just kind of feel like you're in a routine and you get stuck in a rut? Like, that could be anybody. It doesn't matter what you're doing. How do you lead in a way that is the Jesus style versus the me style? I mean, that's for anybody. But I didn't write it with that intent originally. No.
Well, as I read it, I definitely got that feeling that, I mean, yes, it does specifically address ministers, and it is clear that is kind of towards who it's geared towards. But I was just like, this goes for anybody, I think, and so anybody listening, if you're going, oh, well, I'm not a minister, this doesn't apply to me, don't think that way, because it does. Trust me, it does apply to you in whatever field you're involved in and whatever level you're in your walk with Christ or lack thereof or whatever. I think that this is very, very life applicable. Personally, that's what I think.
That's awesome.
I think that's one of those things that's so interesting, because one of the things that I think is a main theme in the book when I was reading through it is talking about the concept of calling. And when the Lord has a calling on your life, how do you walk in that? How do you follow that faithfully, whatever that may look like? And I think that's one of the interesting things where, we say that, this applies to ministers, and talking about, there's a difference between a minister who is called and somebody who's just a career pastor. And so following that calling is important, but that doesn't mean that the person who's called to be a pastor is the only person that has a calling. The Lord calls everybody to himself and to become like Christ, and how do we do that, and what are the specific things we're called to do, is really where it gets down to, like, where we're individuals. And this book does apply to everyone, because you're talking about that concept of, like, well, what does it mean to follow the calling that the Lord has on your life? And so I thought that was really interesting. So do you have anything else to add about that, just in talking about calling and what that means for you?
Oh, that's a big one. So yeah, the difference between like a career pastor and a called pastor, they can be one and the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try to make that point solid, that they can be one and the same. But there are pastors that are career pastors that may have once been called, but somehow lost their way in the woods, so to speak. There are pastors who are called and never really freed to become a career pastor. They have to maintain a career outside of the church. And those guys that I've known are solid, faithful men, right? So I don't know that there's kind of one way to say, okay, you've been called, therefore it looks like this. Mm-hmm. I think that the challenges we have to look at is, you've been called by God, and he's going to lead you down a path that is specifically tailored to you, your experience, your personality, the things you need to learn from, the things you need to grow in, and it's going to be different from the next person beside you, and it's meant to be tailored to that. It's like our Christian walk. And calling is a very funny, weird thing to talk about, because if you talk with certain people, they will think calling is a very abstract term. But did God send you an email, or did he text you late at night? It's like, hey, bro, I need you to do this. Was it like that? I mean, no, of course not. That's not what we're saying. But calling can come from, I personally believe, at least let me explain it this way, that this is how I experienced it, is that little breadcrumbs throughout my life, even prior to being saved, gave me an inkling that there was a certain aspect of life that I needed to pay attention to. For me, it was helping others. It was a reflex. It was something I needed to do. I didn't understand why. It was an automatic reaction in certain situations. And so I knew that I'd be a wholly frustrated person if I didn't do something in life where I was helping others. Now, that was before I met the Lord. When I met the Lord, all of a sudden it had a focus. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, it's help them toward heaven, right? Like help them toward heaven, and that has taken many different shapes and sizes, and through different situations. So I think calling is something that it can come like a flash of lightning. It can be fire in the sky. It can be just small little moments throughout your life where all of a sudden the Lord shows you one day and sews everything together and says, "This is what I've been talking about all of those years. Now let's go and do it together." And how that happens, like I said, I think that's very, very individual. So I've heard many stories of people being called in ways that I cannot relate with, but I respect and think it's pretty awesome,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's their experience. So calling is not abstract, but it is very individual, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, following off that concept of Addie, you brought up calling and career, and just I know you've had experience in this, Earl. Currently, you are a full-time pastor, so technically, being a pastor is your career, and I'm going to call you Pastor Earl from now on, just because I know you hate that. Um, but but a lot of pastors, and you know this because you've done this as well, are bivocational. Um, I mean, let's face it. You go down, you want to buy a car or something, and you go to the bank and say, "Don't worry about it. God will provide." That doesn't work out all the time. I don't know. And my mom's a banker, and I don't think she would take that. I don't think she accepts that as a means of financial support and paying back what you owe. So how do you go about balancing? Because it's notorious that churches, for the most part, they don't exactly pay well. Um, I mean, yes, you do see pastors cruising around on yachts, but that's a different discussion. Um, but for the most part, a lot of pastors, if they can pay at all, they don't pay very well. And even trickling down, like the youth pastors or just the people that work around the church doing things, they sometimes they don't get paid at all. And so they're balancing this calling, which I think is a very real thing on people's lives. Like you said, Addie, we are all called, but they also still have to pay the bills. How do you those in ministry, full time ministry like what you're doing, and then also part time ministry or just volunteer work? How do we combine ministry and real life into under one thing? How does that work for you? How have you seen that played out?
Oh man, that's a good question. So, uh, I I guess I kind of look at it like this. Like, um, there was a while there where I remember just having this, gonna get out in the world, storm the hill, take it for the Lord, plant His flag, and it was like I was driven like a soldier. Um, and then I started to really just read the gospel account, not for the first time, but I mean just to read it with those lenses on of what it means to spend your life in ministry. And the thing that came crashing down around me fairly quick was to realize that Jesus had 3 years of earthly ministry. Um, 3 years. Now, we can say, well, he preached as a boy, and we can go into this, and we know there's years that we don't know about, and sure, we can go into all of that kind of speculation. But what we have in the gospel account, roughly 3 years. And so my prayer stopped being, Lord, help me to die well preaching your word, like when in my old age or older age now. Um, Instead, it became, Lord, I just want 3 good years where I serve you, right? Just 3 good years. And every 3 years, I've been praying that, Lord, just three more, since that came up. And I think, like, the way I look at leadership is that it should be a recognition of what's already happening. So when you see someone who volunteers and they have a heart and a passion for something, you look at it and say, okay, they have a heart and a passion for this. You recognize them in doing that. There are some people that, like a youth pastor, for example, where they're going to start getting the tension between what they have to do in their day job and what they have to do in their church job. And the tension always happens around, well, typically that I've seen anyways, around family responsibilities, when you're a youth pastor or a youth leader and you're single and you can live out of your car and for Jesus kind of thing, hey man, great. If that's what you're called to do, not everybody is, right? And I think there's something wrong with the church that would expect someone to do that. There's something deeply wrong with a church where you've got a few pastors that are in paid positions and then 20 volunteers that work really hard for basic pizza once a month kind of thing. That there's something wrong there. And so the way I look at it is that when I was bivocational, I have been bivocational more years than I have been a salaried pastor. Let's put it that way. And I being who I am, I wanted to do really well in my job. I worked for an advertising agency in Vancouver, and I was being groomed to get in C-level and to start taking over the company. And so I worked pretty hard, and I was planting a church at the same time. There came a point where I would be dragging myself up the stairs at the end of the day, after my commute to get home. And I'd have like 45 minutes before I'd have to lead a Bible study. And that 45 minutes was to spend time with my family. And that's when I realized, okay, I can't do this anymore. That I can't betray them that way. And that's when the lights started going on of realizing, like, I don't know if I can pull this off. The bills still need to get paid, right? And we still need to have, rent money and all of these other things that are normal. And yet I'm called to do this. So I was like, Lord, what would you have me do? And a guy sat me down once. I've had many mentors over the years, and this guy was one of them. And he sat me down. He says, "Look, you can give up your job. Career is optional, but you can't give up your church if you're called to it. Okay, you can't choose career over that. If you're called by God, like Big G God, Lord of the universe, if He has actually spoken into your life and said, 'Son, go take that hill,' you got to go take that hill, all right? But the most important part of that is you can never sacrifice your family. So the only other two options are, what do you do with work and church, right? You committed to your family, you have to serve your family, and that means paying the bills and doing the things. And so there, you get into this tension. Okay, well, if I'm leading a church, you better be good at delegation. You better be good at passing things along. You can't do everything yourself, and you're going to burn out if you do. So the way I looked at it is that I then took that information. My board sat me down and said, "Okay, look, we love you, buddy, but you're going to have to choose between work and church." And I said, "Okay, all right, I'll choose church." And I through other circumstances, I ended up leaving that job, and it was the right thing to do. I'm not saying it was not scary. It was terrifying. I had people telling me I was committing career suicide. Because in that career, if you're not kind of upgrading yourself every few months, you get left behind. And I was committing to lose my knowledge for a long time. To this day, I couldn't step back into it in the same way I was, right? So I think there's always going to be a tension between that called and career. And I, like I said before, they can be one and the same. But when it comes to being paid, it's like, are you willing to be paid in sand? In a bag of sand to do what the Lord has put in your life? And if the answer is no, then you shouldn't do it, because there are going to be moments where you're forced to choose. And if you choose, financial security and stability, that's always going to come back to haunt you. And at the same time, you still have to be financially stable for your family in providing an income. But when you start looking at the paycheck as just a vehicle and a means and not an identity, okay, then you could work anywhere, right? You could do anything to pay the bills. But if you have to be a lawyer because that's who you are, well, that's a choice you're making. If I had to be an advertising executive, that's who I was, and I was getting, accolades and all kinds of things while I was doing that, that's my identity. Well, I can't do that anymore. So it comes down to choice between ego, identity, and are you willing to be paid in sand to do what you do? Because the people who are called, they'll continue and they'll faithfully follow no matter what. The people who are only career, as soon as something goes wrong, or as soon as the church decides, okay, we're going to cut your medical coverage or something like that, they may hop to another church in order to maintain that. And that's what I would call the opposite end of a career pastor. Somebody who's really just, well, they're not giving me 4 vacation weeks a year, and this church over here will give me 6, so I'll hop over there. And at worst, you'd say, well, God told me to. It's like, did he? Right? So that's kind of the differentiation I have, is like, what are you getting into it for? Is it something that you're willing to do no matter what? And you can never sacrifice your family. And if you're called, you can't sacrifice your church, which means your work is going to be something that has to be very flexible, and your identity cannot be rooted in. So that's my opinion. Anyways, hopefully that answers that question.
Mm-hmm.
No, thank you.
No, I think it's a really good distinction. I think part of the distinction that I hear you talking about is like, is the reason behind it. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? Are you pastoring because you're getting a good paycheck and because you get this many weeks of vacation a year and blah, 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 blah? Like, well, that's probably not the best reasoning. It doesn't mean you can't have those things, but you have to be doing it, It doesn't mean that you're getting paid in sand, but are you willing to?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, what's the reasoning and the heart behind it? And I think that's, again, one of the things that you talked about that kind of hits home, because we live in a world that's like, I think it's like allergic to the word submission, because there's so much ego and there's so much self and so much me, 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 that submission is like a 4-letter word. Like, people don't want to hear it. And that's one of the things that you talk about in talking about the reality check of, are you willing to be paid in sand, is that it has to do with submission to the Lord. So I think that's really cool. Is there anything where, when anything else that you have to add to that, just in, behind your reasoning, where it's like that piece of just submitting to the Lord is a huge part of it?
I don't like. I mean, from my worldview, I'll preface it with that. From my worldview, I don't know how you can operate as a Christian, let alone as a minister in the church, without a heart of submission. I'm not sure how you do that. And submission is a brutal thing to go through, because it is dying 1,000 little deaths over your lifetime and choosing others first. It's choosing the Lord before yourself, recognizing that you might work out your days in ministry in obscurity and silence and anonymity, that no one would necessarily ever say thank you for the things that you do for the Lord. And that should make you okay. You should be happy with that. That's a submitted heart, right? And a submitted heart also just gets to that place of like, anything, anytime, anywhere, always, Lord, whatever you want. If he is on the throne of your heart, right? And that's an important question we have to ask all of ourselves. If he is on the throne of our heart, then we should be going to him and it's like, Master, what do you want us to do today? Well, what do you have for us? We'll do anything. And if we can approach it like that, and approach church like that, and leadership like that, if we can approach our families like that, right? Our workplaces, anything at all. If we could approach it with a heart of submission, it's like, oh, Father, what do you want me to do today? How can I be more like you in this situation? Knowing that we're going to fall flat on our faces when we try, knowing that, we're going to need mercy every moment of every day, knowing that every decision we make in leadership may not always be the right one, best one, or the best timed one. Still submitting it to the Lord and just asking, what do you want to do? What do you have in mind? And submitting to that. You're going to have to, let your ego go. Any perceived rights that you may have when it comes to submission. Like I was saying, it's like, when I started working with First Christian here, it's like, I never asked about holiday days, because I assumed that, like, well, okay, I mean, they seem like really lovely people. That'll all work out. But I've known guys that are just like, no, I gotta have this. I have to have a list of things I'm going to demand before you hire me. And you have to follow every single one of those. And it's like, well, that's not a submitted heart. Not in my worldview.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. Anyways.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so interesting to go on, kind of to the next part, one of the chapters that you talk about, and it reminds me about part of what I wrote as well, is about being broken and about having a broken heart, and a part of being submitted to the Lord is being willing to, not only to have your heart broken, but also where there's already been heartbreak and where there already is brokenness, to allow the Lord, into those parts of your heart. And so I think that was a huge thing that hits home, where it's like, you know, we're all broken, and brokenness doesn't negate calling. And sometimes our brokenness is important in our calling. And you even talked about how you grew up and not understanding why things happen the way they happen, and then years and years later, the Lord uses that in a situation in ministry where it's like that brokenness is actually important to allowing you to minister to the people that were around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not people that walk in the church or walk into our lives in the ministry. They're not tithers and seat warmers. We should never think of people like that. And if we do think of them like that, we probably should stop what we're doing. Because everyone comes in with their own frailties and their own stories and their own histories. And they come in with their own pain, victories, their own joys, happiness. Like it's a full basket that you get. Some will let you into that world and share it with you, and some won't. But you have to treat everybody in church like that we're all broken. Some of us may not know it yet. Some of us may not have been broken yet, and that will come. Because when you ask yourself the question, or you say the prayer, which is a deadly prayer to pray, of Lord, break my heart with the things that break yours, He'll show you.
Yeah.
He'll show you. And you may not be ready for that. I don't know how you could ever be ready for that. But sometimes it's the people walking in the church that break God's heart because of the situations that they're going through. They just can't tell anybody. Mm-hmm. I've had situations of people sitting in my office here, and it's like I'm thinking, like, man, no one would ever know this. This hurt, this brokenness, right? This feeling lost, abandoned, and yet they walk in with the greatest smile. And it's heartbreaking. It really is. So you have to walk people through that brokenness, whether they see it or not. And I don't think you can do that well unless you've been broken yourself. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
Running off of that and coming into the title of your book, Real, as you just mentioned, you're sitting in your office, and the role of being a pastor obviously is going to require that sense of brokenness, of humility, and then taking all that in from others as well, like listening to their stuff. And I know from experiences, I'm sure you can't just unsee some things. You can't unhear some things, and it rests on you. So as a pastor, and you go home to your family, as you do, not all pastors are married, some are single, but you go to your other life, your non-pastor life, but all of these things are still with you. And there's almost a sense of isolation, because you can't explain how your day has been. When you come home at night and your wife says, honey, how was your day today? You can't explain that to some people. And, and some people are fortunate enough that they have a wife that they can say, listen, I can't explain it all to you right now. Because obviously you can't just go blabbing everybody's junk out there, but how do you deal with that isolation and keeping this concept of being real? Because like you said, God will break your heart over the things that break His, but who do you go to? How do you talk to somebody about being broken, about these things? How does a pastor deal with this? Almost, like I said, a sense of isolation. And the only thing I can relate to is when I've traveled a lot, mostly, and I prefer to travel by myself. And I go to different countries and different places and different languages by myself. And everybody's like, don't you feel lonely? And when I would get back, I would receive that question, don't you feel lonely? And I knew that the loneliest I felt, the most lonely I felt, was when I came home to all my friends and family and everything I was familiar with, and I couldn't explain my experiences to them. And that was
Yeah.
a feeling of loneliness that I've never felt before. And I can see that from a pastor's point of view. How do you deal with that isolation and that being open to people and saying, I don't know how to tell you that it hurts sometimes? Not necessarily something you're going through, but the way that you experience what others are going through, and how you release that? How do you maintain sanity in the midst of all of that?
You know, when you guys said that I should do this, that I can be interviewed and talk about the book, I actually didn't think you'd be this real. So I
You
want to
kind
ask
of
that.
did open the book with the title "Real,"
Yeah.
so
You wrote the book.
You're right. No, you're right. And I'm grateful, and Aaron, I'm truly grateful for your friendship, because it shows loud and clear right here. But so you can't go life alone. You can't. But I know exactly what you're saying. Being the loneliest moments when you come back and you try and explain to others what you've experienced, and I don't know that you can. What I've had the blessing with is I've found brothers along the way that I have been able to call, and we have had an agreement over the years that it doesn't matter what time or day or anything like that, that we'll pick up and respond. Sometimes that response is just listening, and no judgments. And there have been a couple of times where I have either witnessed or had confessed to me some horrific things. And my friend John Alveston, who's actually he was a regional pastor in Canada, oversaw 23 churches and the Pentecostal assemblies. He and I have been friends for like 30 some odd years, and I have phoned him at some strange times, in tears. And he was gracious enough to just wait until I could speak. I don't know how you get through it without brothers like that. I really don't. I would come home and, Maria would ask me what happened. She knew I was counseling someone or anything like this. We had to come up with a system where I had this, and I would say, this is a red flag issue. And then the questions would stop. And the reason why we had to come up with it is she's a curious cat and she wants to know and understand. But there are some things that if I were to tell her, she would never be able to look at that person the same again. And that's not fair to that person who confessed. It's not fair to have, that in Maria's mind. And so you tend to be isolated in that you have this information. I have some things that people have confessed to me that I will take to my grave without telling a soul, because that's what they asked. And I'm a vault. I mean, if you tell me something, I won't tell anybody. But with Maria, I did have to have just something to protect her. That was like a red flag issue. It's like, just trust me on this one. You don't want to know, right? But with those issues, the burden of some of the things that I've walked through, I've had to say something to someone. And the most recent one, I'm not going to say anything about it other than just to say that it was pretty bad, and it was before I moved to the States. And I talked with my buddy John, and he ended up sharing with me something similar that he went through, that someone confessed to him. And, we just cried on the phone a bit together. We're both, 50 plus men, it's like, and I don't cry very often, I'll tell you that. But this was good, solid brotherly weeping together. And we prayed, we got through it, recognized that there's scar tissue there that we're probably going to carry the rest of our lives. But I don't know what you do. I don't know how you do it without having people to talk to. I think you have to. Because the burden of some of the things you see, depending upon where the Lord has you stationed, and I have been moved around quite a bit. I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver for a while, and that's the poorest postal code or zip code, if you want to say it, in Canada. There are people that live on the street, or if they do have an apartment, they can't afford anything more than rent. So there's a lot that goes on for people that earn money in ways that are what you'd consider unsavory. Okay, and I sat on the street with a lot of those folks, and I heard a lot of stories, and I saw a lot of things, and a lot of things from that time, broke me. And I think what the Lord does, though, is that He will bring you through circumstances that will help you heal. And so one of them was that thing I just said, where I had to phone John and we cried on the phone. That actually was healing for something that I saw years ago, years prior. And I think that's what He does. I think that's what the Lord does, is that if we're in community, if we're in brotherhood, and we are real and we are honest, and we say, this just cut my heart open, and I don't know what to do with it. And I still have to go back to church on Sunday where everybody's just thinking about the buffet they're going to, or whatever good things have happened, or what their kid did at football, and all this great good stuff. It is hard with that broken heart to turn and switch gears and say, okay, I'm going to be excited about this, right? And that is the challenge I think you're talking about, right? Is that from what you've experienced, that there are some things, some wounds you experience, you won't have fully healed this side of heaven. You'll have to do it on your own if you're, careless, and if you're cautious and wanting the Lord to heal you, you'll allow others into your life that will show you the way. And it is hard to relate. But one of the experiences I had in Mexico, I came back and I was on antidepressants for about 2 years after that, because it was I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't, I couldn't function. I had family, and I was told I need to go see someone, and I did, because I don't want to be obstinate, right? And so I went and talked to my doctor, and it was the funniest conversation, because I get along with my doctor really well, or that past doctor, and he asked me, he says, "Are you sleeping?" I said, "No." He says, "Are you eating regularly?" "No." He said, "Okay." "Do you have any fits of anxiety?" "Yep, every day." "Yeah." So we both started laughing. He's like, "Okay, I think you might be having a touch of depression there, buddy." So we talked through it a little bit more, and I was on antidepressants for a bit, and that was a silent thing that I had to go through for a while. And so that is me being real about to answer that question, is that you need people. You really need people. You need people you can tell everything to. The sin that you commit, that you are afraid to speak to anybody, you need someone to tell it to. You need people that can speak into your life and tell you that you're wrong, and you'll listen to them. And you need people that are going to say, you got to go talk to somebody, and you go talk to them. That's part of submission. It really is. And I think when we just think, no, I can tough it out, it's just me and Jesus. Well, Jesus uses a lot of people to help, right? And it is just you and Him. That is true. But that community, the blessing of the family that is the church, can be a beautiful thing if you let it be. And I've seen far too many pastors burn out because they've tried to carry those burdens alone and didn't involve their elder board or the deacons or friends or family. That's a way to burn out. And a lot of pastors remedy that by just simply moving to another church. Which is just a denial, really. But anyway, sorry. I hope that answered that question.
No, I think that's very important. That I think that people in the church need to know that their pastor is also human, and and you spoke about this last week about you going through those periods in your life, but realizing that Jesus also knew sorrow, also knew suffering, and why that's important. And sometimes it's easy for, I think, a pastor or anybody in a position of leadership in a church or elsewhere, it's easy to get caught up in the idea of, I'm supposed to be this. You get this projection, not only internally sometimes, that you see yourself as this, or other people see you as supposed to be this. Either one can be very dangerous, I think. And I think it's important to know that, just because you fill a role of leadership or a role of authority, which I think is important, but you're still human. We all are, and we all struggle. And I think that's a lot of what your book addresses is that just because you're behind a microphone on Sundays, or in modern day cases, it's clipped to your lapel, it doesn't really matter. You're still a person that struggles. You're still a person that feels. You're still a person who can go home at night and cry over maybe something you witnessed, experienced, heard, or something that's happening in your own life. I mean, it's important, I think, for everybody to know that, to have, a group of fellow pastors or fellow congregants or whatever, friends that you can just unleash to a little bit once in a while and know that we're not alone. We're not immune to anything. I think that's
Amen.
important. I think that's a lot of what your book deals with. But moving on from that, you did write in there, and something that stuck out to me. And it was very early on in your book that a friend told you, if there's something you can do other than ministry, do that thing. and you say that with a lot of confidence and assurity, and I think you're right. You want to expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. It's funny because I actually just reached out to that pastor recently to thank him because it's been little nuggets like that he gave me that have been for 35 years or something like that, fueling a lot of my private moments where the Lord just reminds me of who He is. And that guy was very influential into the pastor that I became, and so I wanted to tell him that because by now he's got to be 80. I think it was a while ago, right? Like maybe 70, some odd. Anyways, so I actually reached out to him and I thanked him and apologized for being impatient and impetuous. And when he said that, I was actually asking him about calling, and his name's Joe, and I said, Joe, I don't know what to do. I feel like the Lord has told me what He wants me to do, but I don't know how to do it. I can't. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at that. I'm not good at this. And Joe was very sweet. He was a great pastor, and he just said, look, he said, if there's anything else you can do in life, do that. Don't do ministry unless you know you're supposed to. He says, because it will eat you alive. It's hard. It's thankless. You take on the burdens and sometimes the anger of other people that have never even really had a conversation with you. And if you can't handle those days, don't do ministry. And he said, if your heart is to have a big fat bank account, he said, don't do ministry. And so he gave me a list of these things. I actually wrote some of them in the book, about that. That's because of Joe, was that idea. If there's anything else you can do that. Because there is a cost to it. There's a cost emotionally. And I think unless you have that eternal perspective, that this life is just a blip in time. This is a chapter in our story. It is not the whole story. We live an eternal life now, being sons and daughters of the Lord. We live an eternal life with Him now. And then one day when we pass through that door of life and we enter into the next chapter with Him on a more close level, then it makes all of this make sense. So for him, he was looking at it as that he's looking towards eternity. And he knows that right now, the cost for doing ministry in this world, the way it is, and the cost it is on the person, it's enormous. And if you can't pay those prices, those 1,000 little deaths to self, if you can't do that, do something else. And save yourself the trouble. It's and I can see what he's saying. I understand better now than I did when he said it, because when he said it, I was kind of thinking, jerk. It's not very encouraging, right? but he was right. Yeah.
I think that's so interesting too, where it's and I'll go back to kind of the last two questions, having the people where it's where you can say, hey, I screwed up, and also those people being the people where it's when you don't recognize something, that they could be hey, really honest, brutal truth time. And it's important to have those people. And so another section in your book, which I believe was a recently added section, maybe not recently, but it wasn't necessarily in the first edition of this book, was, I love the title of the chapter, There Be Dragons, because I know this is something where it's like, where you and I have had personal experience with that. Um, but what happens, what happens in ministry when that kind of thing goes sideways, and when you have the people where there's, there's traits from the dark triad, so sociopathy, psychopathy, and narcissism. What happens when you have those people that, take advantage of relationship, where, they don't see people as people, they see people as things, and they see people as resources. And as a pastor and being in ministry, um, people will see that as something that they can use, where people don't want closeness for a relationship. They want closeness so that they can say, well, we're close friends with the pastor. So I guess if you can talk a little bit about, what happens when that kind of thing goes sideways, and what it looks like to deal with those kind of problems.
Well, I got the title for that chapter from, there's a book called Well-Intentioned Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And it is easily on my top 10 list for pastors to read. And it's, I think it's Marshall Shelley or Kelly, I can't remember his name, but anyways, it is one of those books that is by pastors for pastors. So you have interviews from pastors in there, but I think it is so important. If you go to church, anybody should read this book, because what it challenges is where are you the well-intentioned dragon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be as simple as this. You got a pastor who is told to charge the hill, plant the flag for Jesus, do all of this, and he comes with passion and all that kind of stuff. And then this guy says, hey, this is an example from the book that I'm paraphrasing, like, hey, I noticed you're wearing a t-shirt and jeans. I want to buy you a suit, right? And you think, well, I really need this guy's approval because of our father issues, right? That we have, and the father wound that we carry. And so you get this guy to buy you a suit, and all of a sudden, this $800 suit. You show up, you wear it on Sunday, and people are just like, "Oh, you look amazing, right? Way to go! You look so handsome." All this kind of stuff, and it's just your head's going like this. Pretty soon, that guy says, "Hey, I kind of think we should structure the church this way." And then it's like, he's bought you, right? And so that's a well-intentioned dragon. The guy's heart may be all in the right places. He just saw that you had holes in your jeans, and maybe he wanted to help you out. But then he has this opinion, and it may be a good opinion. It may be even a good idea, but it comes now with the weight that you owe him something. Mm-hmm. All right, and that's a well-intentioned dragon. And so the chapter title came from that. There be dragons, because they exist. And in my experience, it hasn't been so much like that one from the book, though there are many examples like that in the Well-Intentioned Dragon book. Where it comes from for me is that you don't know who walks through the door of your church, and you don't know who's sitting there. And you only know through relation. You can only get to know them. And you can't necessarily spot someone who's a narcissist. But you're going to be able to tell. It's like the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, you're going to be able to see fairly quickly that there's an absence of the fruits of the Spirit in some people's lives. They aren't joyful or loving. They aren't kind, right? There's no self-control. They're faithful to their own agenda, okay? But there's no gentleness. I could go on, right? And so you start to see the absence of the fruits of the Spirit, and it allows you to look at that and think, okay, so there's some things I got to pray for here, or pray about, right? And when you get into sociopathy or psychopathy, I mean, those are different beasts. Anyway, I thought I needed to write about this because I kind of feel like I encountered a whole spinning wheel in the last few years of all of this. Mm-hmm. And certainly, like, when it comes to a psychopath, and I'm talking about a dyed-in-the-wool psychopath, a real psychopath, basically a shark in a human suit, okay? Somebody who sees them as the apex predator. They are, everybody else's food or resource, okay? You're not going to see many of them. Like, they're just not walking around at Walmart. I mean, maybe they are, but you're not going to see. Like, it's not going to be like a department of 30 of them. It doesn't. I don't think it works like that. But when you meet a psychopath, there's a chill in the room. You can feel it. There's just this sense. I think it's a wholly demonic thing. Like there's a chill in the room. You don't feel at ease. You don't feel safe with the person. And the way that they speak with you, the way that they look at you, is they're looking through you, right? They're not actually wanting to know. It's like the yawn test. If someone doesn't yawn, right? There's that joke. I'm using this very lightly. If someone doesn't yawn when you yawn, they're a psycho, and it's like that. That isn't entirely true. But the funny thing is that they lack empathy so extreme that you could be breaking down and your life falling apart, and they could literally just say, "So what?" and have no compassion whatsoever. That is a very non-clinical approach to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sociopath, though, is different, because you can be a very high-functioning sociopath and be a pastor. You can be a CEO of a company, right? Like you can, and it's different. It really is. There are high-functioning sociopaths in many, many different walks of life, and some low-functioning ones too. But the ones that are of a higher nature, they will, they're usually the people that have, and narcissism is similar to this. They have a real hard time apologizing. They just don't see it. I mean, a psychopath won't apologize because it's like your food. Why am I going to apologize for my food? Right? So it's a different mindset and attitude. Whereas a sociopath will look at it and say, okay, well, I'm going to do anything to get ahead. I'm going to step on anybody, and I may have to lie for it, steal for it, right? Whatever. I'll do whatever I can to get ahead. That's a different thing. And again, that's a non-clinical approach. But narcissism is the dragon that I think we see a lot of, because you can hide it and just say, well, it's just being selfish. Well, that's a part of it, but narcissism is a very dark beast, and it's you'll never hear an apology from them. It's usually their way or the highway, and it's and zero compassion. But it's really, like, some people will, and very good clinical counselors will not counsel a dyed-in-the-wool narcissist because there's no win. You can't. You sometimes, like, I personally believe, without a move of the Holy Spirit, you really can't change people to be that, because they'd have to recognize that they're not the victim. Okay, because victimization is huge, right? I'm the victim, poor me. How dare you be offended at how I offended you, right? Like that would be that's a classic narcissist, right? Mm-hmm. And so that kind of thing is like you're dealing with that all the time. And in ministry, that's a very real thing. And it's a checklist you have to do to yourself. And I think submission is a part of that. If you're submitted to the Lord, well, you screw up all the time. You have to apologize all the time. You have to surrender all the time. That's a hard checklist that you can do. Some people live their life without thinking they need to. Mm-hmm. And so somewhere on that dark triad, you're going to find people, and unfortunately, you're also going to find them in your church. And it may not be aware, you may not be aware of it until something happens, like a landmine or something goes wrong that exposes this stuff. Mm-hmm. And what you and I had talked about the last episode number 2, which was talking about your book, Abandoned Hope, no, Appointed Hope. I'm just joking.
Stop calling it that.
It was the funniest thing. I rewatched the episode. I couldn't help but laugh at that. Anyway, yeah. Appointed to Hope. We talked about that, just that whole balance between it all and stuff, and how certain triggers will bring things out. And certainly, if you threaten a narcissist, and I mean threaten in the sense of start playing with one of their toys, okay, be it getting to know their family, be it getting to know someone that they care about or whatever, then all of a sudden they're the victim, the jealousy, the rage, everything starts coming out. Because, how dare you play with this toy that I broke and left behind? Right? Yeah. And so that's a narcissistic trait as well. So anyways, I could go on for a long time. I'll stop there, but that's what I meant by with there be dragons, is that they're out there. And I do believe that there's an incredible demonic influence in all of that. Like really, really, like people needing deliverance level stuff. And that's out there. And it's in our churches, it's in our workplaces, it's everywhere. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that made me change the way that I kind of thought about it was, sometimes people people want an apology. So it's like saying, well, I'm sorry that you got blood on your fist when you punched me.
Yeah.
And or I've had those situations where I'm like, well, I'm sorry. And I think about it now and I'm like, I have no idea why I apologized. I'm sorry that you have my blood on your fist because you punched me. It's like, this is the person that thinks that they're in the right for punching you in the face. It's like, again, like I said, it's like, if somebody punches you in the face and they're not recognizing that that's wrong, it's time to stand a little bit further back. But that there's these people where they think that, well, I punched you in the face and now I have blood on my fist, and so you should apologize to me. And that's a very obvious example. In real life, it's obviously a lot more, I think it comes across a lot more subtly. But that, there's a time in ministry and in life where it's like, it's time to hold the line, and it's time for some accountability. And those are people where it's like, they don't like that. And it can be very like almost just anxiety inducing, because it's such a big deal, and because with those people that you're walking into something that's not going to be fun. You're not walking into something where it's like, hey, you hurt me, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, it can be a fight, but there's a time where it's like, the line has to be held. And you talk about this in one of the chapters after talking about the dragons, is that fear doesn't have the final say. That one of the things that we're rescued from is a life of fear. And that doesn't mean that we never have moments where we feel afraid, but that fear isn't our master. Fear isn't the way that we make our decisions, and it doesn't have the final say in what we do. So what does that look like for you, being in ministry, managing moments of fear and living in such a way that, fear is just an emotion, you let it pass by, but it doesn't have the final say?
A good test that I use for myself is control when it comes to fear, because controlling behavior or needing to control something comes from fear. So you have to kind of work backwards. Okay, I'm having a problem where somebody's resisting me controlling the situation, which, praise God, they are, right? Why am I afraid of not having a white knuckle grip on this thing? What am I afraid of, really? And when you walk yourself back from that, using control as a filter, it starts to make some sense. Okay, well, I'm fear of losing something, right? Or I'm afraid of losing someone, or I'm afraid of losing this or that. Like, that fear kind of bleeds into those areas. And I think once you're able to look at that and look at whatever trigger yours is, so for somebody, it's not going to be control for everybody, right? But maybe it's anxiety. Okay, why am I always having anxiety when this person's around? Or why am I always having anxiety when something like this in life happens? And you work back, why am I afraid? What am I afraid of? And it's usually something to do with loss, right? Or on some level. And so whether it's control or anxiety or both or whatever that looks like, you work your way back, and that's where I think fear comes from. Now, I mean, in the book, I tried to talk about a few different forms of fear. But fear of missing out is something that happens in people in ministry, because you look at somebody down the road that's doing something really exciting, and you think, well, I got to do something like that too, right? And even though that may not be your personality or calling, it's like, I have to imitate that, right? And I know my personal failures, my biggest failures in life, is when I've tried to imitate the success of others and tried to be someone who I'm not. Okay, but that was afraid of losing something, losing relevance, or losing people, or losing a position, right? And all of that. And that fear, if you're able to, and I don't think you can ever conquer fear, but I think what it is that you can replace it, because having fearful moments is it's very human, right? I mean, whether it's a physical fear, like that rock is about to drop on my head, I'm afraid, that's reasonable, right? But step out of the way. I'm afraid that my kids are growing up and needing me less and less, right? That is the way of things. It's brutally hard. It's difficult, Okay, but it's the way of things. So, and what am I afraid of? Well, I'm afraid of them losing contact with me. So call them. Like there's certain things that we can do to kind of get through that fear if we just take a breath and stop for a moment and look at what's the truth of the situation. I heard a stat recently that like 80% of the things we think about or ruminate or worry about never happen. So that is a lot of wasted brain power, right? On fear. If we just kind of thought about the 20% that actually does happen, chances are that 20% of things that we think about are not all that bad. So fear can be a real thief. And I don't know who said it. I've lost track of who said it, but that whole idea of that fear and faith can't live in the same heart at the same time, I truly believe that. I really do. You can't be someone full of fear and needing control and say that you have all the faith in the world. You don't. And just admit that and recognize and then work way back. Well, why is that? Because, one of the most honest things I've heard a pastor say in recent times is that he's learning to trust God. And this is a pastor that's been a pastor for over 20 years, right? And I looked at him and I was like, what do you mean you're learning to trust God? Shouldn't you kind of like climbed that hill by now kind of thing? And he explained it in a way that I was like, okay, I totally get that. I understand that now. And I've adopted that for myself too, because it's like we trust the Lord through something, but then we have to remind ourselves to trust again and again and again. Circumstances are different, people are different, situations or whatever. And we always have that, well, I need to control it. I'm afraid, right? I'm afraid God won't show up for me. But if we look at the facts of how many times he has over the course of a lifetime, it's an undeniable proof that he's with us and cares for us and will deliver us and see us through. But in the moment, we're just afraid. So if we step back and look at the truth of it, then fear doesn't have hold on us. It doesn't have to. And we can renounce it. We can move beyond it. But it's a choice. It's always a choice to have fear versus faith. So for me, it's like you look at, okay, what am I holding on to? What am I trying to control, right? If it's my self-image, okay, well, I hate to say it, but that is a narcissistic tendency, right? I mean, in John 12, the woman who, washed Jesus' feet with that, the nard, right, the ointment, she didn't care who was looking. She let her hair down, and in that day, that was not fit for a woman to do, right? A woman of good standing, right? She didn't care that she was spending her dowry or what could have been retirement savings or something like that. It was worth so much. She could care less, right? And that's the thing about love, is it doesn't care who's looking. It doesn't care what people think of you. Its only regret is it doesn't have more to give. And that's so much the opposite of fear, which wants to control. It's no, I have to hold on to this super tight because I don't trust anybody. I don't trust God that he's going to see me through. So my bank account has to be this much money all the time, right? And fear can creep into lots of different areas. But I do believe it's just, what are you afraid of? Work backwards, right? What are you experiencing in that now? What is giving you pushback? Is it controlling? Is it something else? And then work back. What are you afraid of losing here, right?
And I think that's really interesting, because it's not about never experiencing fear. It's more that fear is kind of a fork in the road, where it's like you have to make a choice in how you respond to it. Are you giving into it, and are you giving into fear? And it reminds me of that. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money, or you cannot have fear and faith in the same heart. You can't be on the throne of your own heart because you're living in fear and needing to control, and then at the same time be submitted to the Lord. So it's about that. You have the moment, and there's the fork in the road, and you have to make a choice, about how to respond to it in a way that is faithful and submitted. It's really interesting.
I think that one of the fears that you can face very easily as a minister is the idea of qualification, or to put it in churchy terms, I'm not worthy to be a pastor. It's like, and some people look at that as like, oh, that guy never went to Bible college, or that guy never went to seminary, or that guy, I used to know him out at the bars all the time, or he was in gangs or whatever. And a lot of times a minister can let the things of the past or the things that they haven't yet accomplished hold them back from doing what they have been called to do, and vice versa. It works on the flip side too. Somebody says, I went to all this school and education, I've lived a holy life my whole life, therefore I should be the pastor. And that works both ways, I think. But this idea of worthiness, how does that play into the role of a pastor? And one, not getting caught up in qualifications, and two, not letting the lack thereof hold you back. And I'm not saying you're one of either of those. I'm just saying this is something.
No, I think, I mean, for me, a healthy approach is, and anybody's listening from our church to this may be a shock, but like I walk into every Sunday with this sense that I'm the one guy wearing a sequin tank top, and everybody else is wearing tuxedos, and at some point someone's going to say, excuse me, like you're not fitting in here. Every Sunday. Now, that's a horrible image to portray. But,
yeah, thanks for that.
I don't know that I can actually imagine you in a sequin tank top.
I don't own one, if that actually helps. But yeah, the reason why I say it like that is that there's part of that's just flat out spiritual warfare, right? Mm-hmm. The enemy trying to steal your identity, and that's something I have to go through every week leading up to a Sunday. But to more the point of the question from a longer term perspective, I worry about the pastor that feels they're worthy. I worry about those guys. I really do. I worry about the guy that thinks he's qualified, because I've known people with their PhD, guys with master's divinity, all kinds of things, that are good men, but it's taken them many, many, many years to become useful to the body of Christ. And when I say useful, I mean in the sense that if somebody walked in the door and needed food, could they drop what they're doing and help them? And most, I hope all, would say, absolutely. What are you talking about? What a stupid thing to say. But I have known guys that wouldn't, and I worry about them. I can't really look at how the apostles were chosen and see that Jesus said, well, you know what, I want you to go spend some time with those Philippians, or, I want you to go and, you're going to have to go get qualified for this and qualified for that. And I think the way we can look at it is that if you're called to be a heart surgeon, okay, go to school. Please, go to school. Right? Don't try and pick it up on YouTube. Like, first off, gross, but second, please do us all a favor. Do it, and don't be the top or the bottom 5% of your class. Do really, really, really well if you're going to be a heart surgeon. Some people are called to things like that in ministry where they need to do this. They need to go to school because they need to be able to present an argument to academia or in a different way, in a different world than most of us operate. So go to school, get the arguments down. Right? And therefore let the Lord qualify you for what you've been called to do. Mm-hmm. But if you're called to pastor a church, okay, then I truly believe the biggest question you're going to be asked is, have you learned how to love yet? Because you can come with all the theology that you want. You can come with all the credentials and degrees and whatever meaningless things I have on my wall here. You can have all of that stuff and still not have a heart of love. And therein lies the problem. So when it comes to worthiness, it's like I believe a pastor has to be broken and see themselves as a broken person. I think a pastor has to be called and know that they're called, that even if they're doing it out of the trunk of their car, they're going to keep doing it until the Lord himself says stop. I think that a pastor has to look for his worthiness and not his accomplishment through anything else but the Lord. And where I quite often see this and what I struggled with myself is that when you finish a sermon and you're driving home from a Sunday afternoon or on a Sunday afternoon, are you waiting for your family to say, that was such a good sermon, right? Are you waiting for someone to do that? Because That's not their job, right? I mean, they may feel moved, and they may say, hey, dad or husband or whatever, that was great. You really knocked it out of the park that day. And you know what? You take those compliments and just like praise the Lord, right? This is great. I got to do it another day, and I didn't speak heresy. I didn't swear, right? All of these which are possible, right? And it's great. But if you're doing it or doing ministry for praise of people, then the worthiness is misplaced, right? Because then we're all of a sudden in this situation where it's like our validation is through others, and it can't be. I mean, if the Lord has told you to faithfully take up this charge and do this, then let Him be the one that gives you the attaboy. Like let Him be the one that says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And right now, all I hope for is when I pass from this world to the next, that the Lord will just look at me and say, "Well done," But I don't need anybody on earth to say that, right? Because the Lord sees the invisible moments. He sees the quiet, obscure things that we do. He sees the decisions that are made that nobody will ever talk about, that are all for Him. And that's who I think our worth should come from. So when you talk about qualification, what degree will you study to be able to take it to Jesus and say, "Look, I studied this for you"? And He might say, "Great. Have you learned how to love yet?" Right? That person that you didn't give the hat to that asked for it, that you could have, what did your degree help you with that? Right? And if you're on a stage and where you're dealing with guys like Richard Dawkins, for example, or a talk like that, be educated. The guy's like a snake, but I tell you, he's not a dummy, right? And so, and speaking from an evolutionist point of view, so with that, like whatever you're called to do, train for it. Let the Lord lead you through it. You may not be able to avoid school in pursuing His calling for you. You may be somebody that's called to steward and financially gift the church so that the church can go on to do more things. Okay, so study to what you have to do, whatever it is. You may be called to, take that medical degree and go and, help kids off the coast of Africa, on a ship that's dedicated to dental care and things like that. Go do that, but go to school for it. If you're called to preach the word and you're called to lead a church or plant a church, what more do you need than the word of God, right? And you first need it in your heart. There's no school that will prepare you to love like Jesus loves. I mean, other than the school between you and Him. And so when I think of worthiness, it's like it always has to come, our self-worth has to come from the Lord and not other people, right? I've fallen into that trap before, and it's a bad one, right? Our worthiness has to be measured not by what we do here on this earth, but when we get to heaven, and just that release and relief, we made it home. So
thank you. Yeah. I have one last question for you, but actually two, but one of them's really short. But on page 111 of your book, for those of you at home following along, you pose the hypothetical question, and I think it really, in my opinion, really captures the essence of what you're talking about this book in entirety. And very simple, you said, what if we were to stop looking at people as a flock or projects? And then you reverse that and you said, well, what if they stopped seeing clergy or community? And so with that in mind, and what you're posing throughout this whole book is this concept of dropping pretenses, dropping projections, but looking at people differently in the congregation, and then that flowing over to the congregation looking at the clergy differently. What is your vision in that? What would you like to see?
I think you kind of said it pretty well earlier, just in that, pastors are human. We're frail, right? You say something harsh, it hurts, right? And you have to go through that. And I think it's a mistake when the pastor doesn't look at people that same way as well. And I talked about it, just the people that are walking through the door with their hurts and stuff. But I think if we could just for a moment stop worrying about how many people show up for church, okay? If we could just stop for a moment and just worry about how they leave the church. That might be a step in the right direction. One of the things I do every Sunday here is I pray over every row of chairs, and I pray over the stage for the worship team. And when I'm praying, the thing I usually leave off with both is like, Father, I pray they do not leave here without feeling your Father's love. Right? That gentle care from the Holy Spirit. I pray no one leaves this building without feeling that. However it happens, doesn't matter. Maybe they ignore the sermon altogether. Doesn't matter. The point is that they leave feeling the Father's love somehow, through someone. And I think if we take that approach, then all of a sudden we start taking the focus off of the show, which is where it needs to be. And it's about the flock, of which pastors are a part of, not apart from it. And that's I think I don't think so. When I do a sermon, I'm also recognizing the Lord is going to face roll me through whatever the topic is the week prior, so that I can get in here. And when it's in here, then I know there's somebody out there where it's in there too. And then in that moment, we're a community. We're together. We're a family. And as that, then we can step through it together as well to whatever the Lord has for us. So I feel like if we take our eyes off the show, off the numbers, off the dollars, and we live a life of faith and not fear when it comes to a congregation, and we just love people, I think beautiful things can happen. It's not easy, and it's not everybody's going to get it, but there's something beautiful that happens when they do. And one of the first things, and I bet you there's people that from our church that haven't even noticed this yet, but one of the first things I did here is I removed the sign that had the numbers of attendance for each Sunday because it's the wrong metric. And the thing is, nobody has asked me about it. Nobody has mentioned it. Not one person, which means either nobody missed it or they thought it should go as well. I don't know, but I don't care. It doesn't. That was one of the first things I did here, was just silently just like take that down and put that away. And because it's the wrong metric, and if we stop worrying about, how many people show up and just are they leaving feeling the Father's love, then we've done our job, and that includes us, the people who serve at church as well. So
I think it would be neat, just my own personal experiences in church leadership roles, and just to be able to just be part of the church.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I left my last job as a youth pastor, and I left for very good reasons. One, they didn't need a youth pastor anymore. But two, I wanted to just be able to go sit and be ministered to and not feel like church was a job. I wanted that sense of I wasn't part of the community. I was just supposed to point them in the right directions. And that's fine. And sometimes that's the case, but I wanted to just be a part. And I think that a lot of pastors feel that sometimes, and it's easy to be that way. And we start to sense this idea that the congregation and us, whereas it should just be an us kind of thing. And I think that's why I wrote in your book. Yes, I wrote in your book. I wrote in there, I was like, this is the point. This is what you're trying to say through this whole book, is that let's just drop it all and just get real with each other. I think that's really neat.
Yeah.
And I think you summed it up very well with that one question.
I think that's why I asked you to write the foreword, right? Yeah, you get it. Thank you for that.
My second question, my last thing, and then I'll leave you alone. In your list of things to read, which is always really good, you listed Don Quixote by Cervantes. You might as well listed Institutes of the Christian Religion. I mean, that is a massive piece of work. Not in that it's long, but it's intense. Why did you put that in your recommended reading?
Okay, so I started to do an English degree a long time ago. But
that wasn't even written in English, by the way.
Yeah, no. The reason why I have Cervantes in there is because when I think of the books that I think a pastor should have, okay, and one of them is Startup CEO. It is not a Christian book, but it is about starting a company from nothing and how you have to delegate and learn leadership skills. It's invaluable. Don Quixote, I think, is equally as invaluable, but not for the same reasons. Because there are moments where you're going to go tilting off at windmills, and there are going to be moments where, Dulcinea gives you problems, and there's going to be moments where all of this stuff, happens, and you're going to seem like you're in your right mind. Because that's the thing. I mean, he thought he was in his right mind, but he was crazy. And I think every person has to, especially in ministry, has to say, okay, am I being the crazy Saul, right? Or am I being the younger Saul who, dropped the farm tools and went and saved the priests that were being held? And, there's a difference there. And I think Cody's one is, don't be that guy that thinks everybody else is crazy but you. Because it might just be you, the one that's taking a lance and running at a windmill when it's nothing, right? So that's why I included that book. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But I also recommend it. I think it's a great book.
Yes, it's a great book. I believe it's also on Amazon.
It is also on Amazon, along
I'll
with
have a link below, along with A Pointed to Hope and a couple other books like A Tale of Three Kings. I know we talked about having that on there as well. So that's that was a great book for me for sure. So yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there anything else? I'm losing my ability to talk. Is there anything that you would leave for people that are watching or listening as a challenge in response to listening to this?
If money and time were not objects, if they didn't matter, what would you do? What would you do for Jesus? If money didn't matter and you had all the time in the world, what would you do for him? Because that just might be the beginning to the answer of, God, what am I supposed to do? And then it's the battle of fear and faith. Do you need the money, right? How much time do you really need? And all this kind of stuff. So that'd be my challenge right now. It's like, if money and time were no object, what would you do for the Lord today? And I dare you to do it.
Awesome.
That's a great question. I still think about that every single time you ask it. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's such a big question. But anyways,
and it's a question you posed in your book.
What's that?
Everybody should get up and go get a copy of this. It's really good.
Yes. So there will be links below if anybody wants to purchase Real and read Real or any of the other books that we've mentioned. And we will be back next week. I don't actually know what we're talking about next week yet, but
I do.
Oh wait, you do. What are we talking about?
Would you like to introduce it?
No, because I don't either.
Aaron, who is a faithful believer. I'm going to brag about you for a second because I know you're not going to do this yourself. He's a faithful believer, has a SCAD of education theologically, and is also, from what I've understood and seen, pretty talented in the worship department. So Aaron's going to talk about worship. And where that goes, nobody knows. But that's Aaron's going to talk about worship next week. So, right?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. There we go.
I would like to point out that Addie also does worship, so she's going to be doing some talking too.
She does. Yes, most certainly. She is. She's one of our worship leaders of the church for sure.
Addie can't remember how to play piano when she's in charge of worship. There's frequently moments where we practice and I just slam my hands on the keyboard because I'm just like, I can't do it. But
you know what I've noticed the three of us are particularly good at is self-deprecation.
Maybe we should have a podcast about self-deprecation.
There you go. Okay, well, thank you guys, and I appreciate that, and thank you for trusting me with
thanks for sharing that with us.
Yes, thank you. I feel bad. I feel like I kind of strong-armed you into doing this one, but
I'm just submitting to what the Lord had. That sounded a lot worse than I meant it.
So,
Okay.
Okay.